event's part of our organisation's current campaign, Fossil Fuels Are a Health Hazard, and our contribution to addressing this climate emergency. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many unceded lands on which we meet tonight. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us this evening. Fossil fuels are everywhere. In fact, arguments put forward by many revolve around the ubiquitous nature of fossil fuels and their past and current contribution to our way of life. Some assert we can't disentangle ourselves from fossil fuels. Economies will fail, chaos will reign. Similarly, throughout history, when we've moved to improve things like air quality or water quality from polluting industries, the common catch cries of "we'll all be ruined" from vested interests have been rolled out. Yet, progress has continued. And as far as air and water quality goes, things improved. We have examples of massive international change where human and environmental health has been threatened. For example, the phasing out of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, that were destroying our protective ozone layer. Alternatives were found and the world didn't end. We're here to say the same applies to fossil fuels. And we have to make this change for our own health and the health of our planet. The health message is our strongest tool for almost all major changes that have involved collective resolve, such as chlorofluorocarbons, smoking, and more recently, manufactured stone. Health has been the centre of persuasion. Tonight, we're going to hear from three wonderful speakers. First, we have Royce Kermelovs. He's an Australian freelance journalist and author who recently published the book Slick, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil, published by the University of Queensland Press. He'll tell us about the current vested interests in the Australian petroleum industry and how they're seeking to strong-arm governments and joined a global effort to bury the science of climate change and delay action despite knowing the harms it would cause. Anyone watching the politics playing out in WA at the moment can see this dynamic in action. Darren Johanson is the Product Stewardship Manager for the Smart Energy Council, an independent body promoting zero emissions energy technology and organisations to pursue an emissions-free future. Darren will be discussing what's at the cutting edge of energy technologies in Australia as alternatives to fossil fuels. And we also have Dr. Kate Wiley, our organisation's Executive Director, a general practitioner and our fearless leader in promoting better human and planetary health through elimination of all forms of fossil fuels where possible and stopping their devastating impacts on the health of us, our children and our planet. Okay, so let's kick off with our first panellist. Royce, your book. Can you give us a sort of overview about the things that you found and the things that you've covered in your book?
Yeah, and can I say before I begin, like, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's great to be here with everyone in such esteemed company, and on a on a day, I should say, with a note of sorrow that the Australian government has approved 3 new very large coal mines, so we should at least acknowledge that going in. And I'm thinking it's really important to discuss this story and what we're going to talk about today, the tactics that we use, the history, the lobbying, how we got here, and what we can do about it, because this stuff is hugely significant to how our politics shape up going forward and how they have been formed in the past. And for me, I guess, I'm here because I wrote this book, Slick, which is, you can kind of see behind me if I do some kind of presentation, which kind of unpacked this story going right back to the very beginning, as Steph said. So, it's an important conversation to have, because when most people here will understand that Exxon knew, or that the oil and gas industry was involved in a campaign of climate denial, but those are talking points, those are thought bubbles up in the air. It's not very often people have the story laid out before them, or that's put into an Australian context. So so I went back to kind of look about, well, what happened? When did this industry know? What do they know about climate change? What did they, and how do they use their influence to stop anything from happening about that? And what was Australia's role in this? And what's fascinating is the story goes back much further than most people thought, further than the mid 2000s, further than the 90s, further even than the 80s. The start of this, the genesis, really begins with one scientist in Los Angeles who was kind of investigating the smog that was kind of circulating above the city. And the very short version of a long story, if I can be a little bit flippant to kind of make sure we keep the time, is this guy kind of took one look at the cars on the road, took one look at the smog, put two and two together, and then started doing the research to connect those things. And when he released his first reports, the automotive industry in the US freaked out. Now, as this was going on, the oil industry at the time in the US, which was more or less the global oil industry, because it was kind of Britain and the parts of Europe and the US that were involved in this, saw this research and was also watching what was going on with tobacco on the other hand. And so tobacco, there was a couple of researchers who swabbed the back of some mice and grew tumors from this, and it made the connection between smoking and cancer. And they could see the litigation that was building up against tobacco companies. They could see the political pressure that was building up. And so the oil industry then looked at this and was like, okay, well, we've got this issue about carbon dioxide and greenhouse effect that's been identified as being part of this smog issue. We've got this issue with tobacco over here on the other side. What does this mean for us? And the answer was basically they knew that at some point they would come under pressure. They would face similar lawsuits. They would face similar political pressure. People would start getting mad about this potential greenhouse effect. And so to kind of get across this, they started studying it. And from here you start to get all the kind of all these studies coming out that were internal to industry that they never shared, explaining that, hey, there is a thing called the greenhouse effect. All that oil, gas, and coal we are burning is undermining this kind of, the stable balance, the ecological niche in which human society exists, and it's going to completely change the atmosphere, and then ultimately lead to a change in climate. And so I think, and that's a really important part of the story, because what happens next for Australia, I think, is the significant bit, which is at the same time those studies started to be produced at the end of the 60s, the Australian industry was just getting going. Australia didn't have an oil industry until 1953. That was the first time oil was found, and it still took them a decade to get off the ground. At that time, the industry was already organizing itself. It was already building a political formation through its industry associations to encourage the creation of this industry. And to get off the ground, they went to the US and asked for help. And specifically, they asked for money and know-how to get the industry here off the ground. And so for me, I think the key point, the starting point, I think, is this kind of idea of an original sin, right? Where the Australian oil industry began at a time when the global oil industry was aware that its activities would cause harm down the track, but then it went ahead anyway. And the expansion that followed was massive, as most people will be here to know. And I think this is also another critical piece of information. And I don't want to kind of continue talking too long, but please, Steph, interrupt me if I'm going over. But the final thing I think is really important about this is that the industry from the beginning was because it was aware of the risk posed by the tobacco industry. There is a popular concept that big oil today borrows from the big tobacco playbook of yesterday, but actually the situation is the reverse. So when you go back and look at these documents, as I did in the book, I went back and looked through all the tobacco industry archives, what was available from the oil industry archives, that's been found by other researchers as well. What was really clear was that the oil industry wrote the public relations playbook with which they used to control the narrative, to control how the public, how policymakers thought and spoke about issues like the environment, or in the case of tobacco, smoking and health. And in doing so, and as tobacco was coming under pressure, these companies then arranged to share the same scientists, same labs, same researchers with their friends in tobacco, who then took those ideas, that took the idea of using science to fight science and weaponized it in defense of tobacco. So and in doing so, they kind of perfected the art for this. So I think when we bring it back to kind of the events today that I believe Darren's going to talk about, and where we are today, when we're looking at kind of the Australian landscape, when we ask questions like, why are we approving new coal mines? Why are we approving new gas projects? How is this expansion continuing? I think it's worth starting from the position that this is a fight that has been going on for a very long time. It's not something that's going to end overnight. It's not something that people are just like, people who are doing this are going to give up and walk away. This has been a concerted effort over a number of decades that has a long history.
I think it really highlights the point that having the fossil fuels industry in the room with government where regulations are being developed is exactly the wrong strategy, because their interest is completely contrary to progress. And what's more, it I guess makes a bit of a mockery of things like industry ideas of carbon trading rather than carbon taxation as a mechanism for reducing our emissions. So Darren, over to you. You're in the Smart Energy Council. You're sort of partnering up with lots of different organisations that are, madly trying to figure out solutions to fossil fuels in Australia. Can you give us a bit of an update on, what's out there and what's going on?
Steph, thank you. Just by way of introduction, the Smart Energy Council is a renewable energy advocacy group. We actually started 70 years ago, and we were started by a group of scientists with a view of asking the question, how do we better advocate for this technology? So our organisation has been around a long time, and I think the origin is really important because we try to take kind of an evidence-based approach to all the work that we do. This conversation's actually, it's quite a kind of a complex one, and there's a lot of nuance in it. But if it's okay, I'd like to start off by making 3 points, right? And the 3 points kind of interconnect. So, just following on from Royce's work, I mean, it's fantastic work, and feel free to let him talk longer because there's so much interesting data points that he brings to the table. Many of the data points I've never heard before. But I think it's important to understand that corporations do what they do. It is the nature of public markets. And in my role as a stewardship manager, I see the sort of behaviour that Royce is talking about in the oil industry happen in stewardship via greenwashing. And I see it in subtle ways and overt ways every day in the work that I do. And it's interesting that, we have a social contract with corporations which allows them really the freedom to bullshit. And, we have a label for that, which we call puffery. And we know this is true, obviously, because, that we accept this social contract, because any one of us who looks at a hamburger ad at a McDonald's, the hamburger on the sign and the one that we get is a completely different thing. But as consumers, we think that's kind of okay. And from a stewardship point of view, we endorse this social contract every day when we walk down a supermarket aisle and buy kind of quote unquote green products. And I think this is a really important point to understand. The companies do what they do. I'm not endorsing it. It's a fact, and I don't like it either. But I think in terms of when we get to talk about actions, we need to accept this and accept that there's a big role for organisations like ourselves and yourselves in driving the civil society toward better outcomes. So that's just the first point. My second point is, when we're talking about the renewable energy transition in Australia, it's interesting that this is a two-speed conversation. What I mean by that is we have this miraculous outcome in Australia where nearly 40% of Australian homes have installed solar PV on their homes. And we increase that by roughly 30,000 households a month. It's pretty phenomenal. It's the highest penetration anywhere in the world, and it's pretty much unique to Australia. So when we think about the work that fossil fuel companies have done against the market, against solar PV, it doesn't seem to have worked because the electorate is clearly bought in. And yet, as we just heard, we're still opening new fossil fuel mines, still opening gas fields, and still having a ludicrous national debate about climate change. So my point is, why is there this disconnect? And I think the answer is economics, and that economics is driving our decision-making, and economics kind of without values. But what I'm saying is that consumers have bought solar PV because of the economic benefit to them, obviously lower energy costs, And governments are still in bed with, and enterprises are still in bed with fossil fuels because of economics, because of profits. So this is a kind of the free market at play. Now, before anyone yells at me, I'm headed somewhere because of this. Because this brings me to the last point I'd like to make, which I'm going to summarize with a quote. And it's from a guy called Paul Sappho, who was at the Institute for the Future and the Singularity Institute. He said, technology change takes longer than you think, but happens far sooner than you expect. Whilst the fossil fuel lobby may have delayed the transition, it's my view that they've already lost the war, but it's not widely understood yet. And the reason for this is fundamentally economics. Fossil fuels industry currently are really struggling to get investment. The industry knows that they're actually running out of raw materials. So if you Google how many years of oil reserves have we got left, you'll see 47 years. Gas is roughly 49 years. Coal's a bit more, 150 years, something like that. The US is now the biggest single producer of oil, but that's just because what they're doing is basically using bigger straws to draw down their reserves faster, and they're getting diminishing returns with shorter paybacks. And so investors are starting to walk away from the industry. From an economics perspective, they're also, generally speaking, losing their social license. I mean, young people, as we know, they don't even want to buy a car. But the key point I want to reflect on is that they've been outpaced by stepwise changes in renewable energy technology. Now, at the moment, we would all know that renewable energy is demonstrably cheaper. It's the cheapest form of energy anywhere. But what we're about to see is a massive system-wide change in the costs. My first point is that in China, this year, there's been a massive increase in the manufacturing capacity for solar PV in China. So their manufacturing capacity is now 1.2 terawatts of capacity. So in the last year, we've seen in the market, our prices have fallen by about, module prices, by about 40%. Now that's with this 1.2 terawatts of capacity operating at less than 50% capacity. So once they engage that capacity over the next 12 months, we expect the prices to fall even further. And in a similar way, battery energy storage system costs are expected to follow Moore's law and continue a rapid pace of decline. And we're expecting to see battery energy storage system costs, to drop by 50% over the next 18 months and continue to drop by 50% every 2 years thereafter. So this is going to lead us to a ubiquity of affordable energy storage, which will completely redesign the way our energy grids operate. So yes, they've made delays, but the economics that once supported these companies will suddenly, and I mean very suddenly, change, leading to a rapid decline in their organisational value. And we expect to see billions of dollars in stranded assets. And if anyone would like to know more about that economics cascade, I can direct you to two really good publicly available reports, one by the Rocky Mountain Institute and another one by Rethink X.
Interesting, very interesting. We just hope that it all happens quickly enough so that they don't take everyone else out with them. So, Kate, this comes to, I guess, Doctors for the Environment role and what we're, our sort of angle, and I guess some of the sort of information we've been pulling together for our campaign. Do you want to just take us through the recently published report, Fossil Fuels Are a Health Hazard, and, the sort of the key takeaways in terms of the health effects of climate change and also all of the products of using fossil fuels?
Sure, Steph, I would love to. But before I do that, I just want to sort of, put my 2 cents in about the delay and about what happens there, why that's happened. And, like I hear what you're saying, Darren, about market forces and, that sort of, there's like this dissonance, right? You know, like on one hand, they know what they are doing is wrong, but they're kind of going to flog the dead horse. You know, like the continued use of fossil fuels has to be unethical. Like we have to use those words. Where's our ethics? You know, there's all these harms. We know the harms are there. There's well-established evidence about harm. You know, and we've known this for a long time, right? And you just have to wonder, you know, what's going on psychologically for people now? I mean, maybe we just get a little bit skeptical and say the fossil fuel industries are just greedy and they're just quite happy to continue to spruik their product because it means that they can, you know, continue to live in a nice house and drive a nice car, whatever. But there has to be some kind of level of denial going on in their brains to allow this to continue. And I think the same thing happens when we look at, you know, our environment minister signing off on a new coal mine or the government putting out the future gas strategy. At some level in their brains, there must be some level of denial because they continue to be swayed by the fossil fuel lobby. They continue to accept money from them. And they just keep going down this expected path, this sort of neural groove, this thing they've always been doing. You know, and like I've got some sympathy for people in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, you know, when we first were sort of told about this and started to think about it. Because I think at that time people couldn't imagine what it would mean. You know, like they'd say, oh, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees global warming. I don't think people could really see it, couldn't imagine it. You know, because the world at that time was just, you know, the world was so big and vast and endless almost, and such a massive system. How could we possibly change it to the extent that we have? But, you know, now we're at a point where we don't need to imagine it anymore. It's happening here around us, and we're seeing all those terrible health effects, which, you know, the storms and the floods and the fires and all of that. You know, the Torres Strait is sinking. You know, the people there are drowning from a rising ocean. You know, so the people of islands all over the world. So, you know, for us to continue to do that now, when we don't need to imagine, when it's right in front of us, that's morally bankrupt. And, you know, we really have to realize that we're kind of dependent and we're kind of behaving like addicts, that we continue to use them the way that we do. And I suppose that, you know, is the point of the report, is that, you know, coal and oil and gas are the sort of primary drivers of the planetary health emergency, to all the things that we are doing. You know, all these, you know, global warming, greatest health problem facing humanity, caused by coal, oil and gas. You know, and I won't list all the health effects because I think most people here know them and we can look them up. Primary drivers of air pollution. You know, air pollution kills more people globally than smoking. Air pollution also does come from burning wood stoves and things as well, but fundamentally, fossil fuels. They are the source of plastics. You know, what does plastics mean? Macro pollution, biodiversity loss. It means atherosclerosis, endocrine disruption, you know, things like infertility, all these forever chemicals. How terrifying are they? You know, and the impacts of all these things on biodiversity and our non-human kin and our food and water insecurity and all of that. And so, you know, the whole point about fossil fuels are a health hazard as a report is to say that all this stuff, all these terrible things that we're all scared about and that we all talk about, comes back to coal, oil and gas. You know, the fossil fuels are the things that are driving all this stuff. And in the report, you know, we've got our life cycle analysis. And the whole point of that is to sort of show how, you know, it's, have a look at the report. Oh, you can't see it, the life cycle analysis in the report. It just shows that really coal, oil and gas are at the beginning of all this thing. And when it comes back, what this means to people, you know, because we're suffering. And now, yeah, and we're only going to suffer more and more. You know, last year, the hottest year in recorded history. So was the one before that. What's this one going to be? What's next year going to be? 10 years from now? Yeah, and what does that mean for us? You know, and what does it mean? Like a lot of health professionals in this room, what does it mean for our patients? We're seeing it now. We see it when there's a heat wave, more people walk in. We see what storms mean for long-term mental health of our patients. You know, people who work in farming communities, what it means for people there. But, you know, for everyone, really, you know, no one's going to escape it. So I don't know, I'll stop rambling, but like fundamentally, we're at this point where we have a planetary sort of community that is overly dependent on something that is killing us. And we've got to get out. Otherwise we're risking the farm, basically. It's time to quit.
Thanks, Kate. So just along those lines, Royce, you begin your book with the story of Kate Stroud regarding her experience of the Lismore floods. Can you give us one or two stories, maybe Kate's story and maybe one or two others, just to sort of give us a sense of how the issues you're covering affect people on the ground?
The story you're referring to, Kate Stroud, was a very powerful story, and I chose to open that as one of several stories I heard it after in the wake of the Lismore floods. Kate was a young woman who kind of was told that her house was safe, and then suddenly the flood waters rose, came through her floorboards. This chocolate mud bubbled up through, and then just absurd things started to happen as her Monday morning, when she should be going to work, was turned topsy-turvy. Her and her partner were standing in her house looking out at the park that used to be across the road and noticing it now being like essentially a lake. And and they heard this noise, and her partner was like, "Is that a cow?" And then that cow then gets washed up and slammed against the front railing of their house, and they have to go out and dislodge this poor animal that desperately wants help. And for her in that moment, that was just kind of symbolic of this whole awful crisis that they all found themselves in. And there's a couple points on this. I did this for a very specific reason, because when we talk about climate change, we talk about kind of what to do about it. There is a risk of getting very abstract, of getting very wonky in some cases. But I wanted to be very clear about what we were talking about, what the consequences we were talking about, and by making it personal, by showing that harm and the near-death experience this person have, it was a way to kind of really put the stakes up front. And the second thing is, if you read the book, you notice throughout that a lot of the stories, the little profiles that are filtered in to kind of illustrate some of these wider points, are often from young people. They're often from people who are 30 years old, younger, older, just give or take, people who are inheriting the world that we are leaving them, and who are reacting to it in this moment, and who are realizing that their lives, that they're making decisions about their lives, all their hopes and dreams and things they want for themselves, and that they are making decisions about that stuff in an environment where a whole series of other decisions that were made before them that created this set of circumstances that they now have to react to, and not all of them are happy about it. So and I'm not an activist, I'm a reporter. I'm quite happy to report that and bring that onto the page. But this also ties into something also that Kate was just saying as well. When you understand that part of the story, and then you start to look at the history, and then you start to look at, okay, well then what else did these industry people know? And if we put that in a health context, you find really interesting things. Like, for instance, the Australian Gas Association was aware in the late 60s that by bringing natural gas into the home, which was their big plan, there was almost a political manifesto that was put together in the middle of the 60s to roll out natural gas to replace town gas, which was manufactured with the stuff they're pulling from the ground, and completely change the industry. They were aware that burning that in their home without proper ventilation would lead to what they called breathing problems, right? And this was the same fear that was kind of spread for the US gas industry at the same time, which was also undergoing an expansion. And the reason why they were terrified that people might learn this is because then people might not put gas in their homes, because they didn't want anything to interrupt the rollout of this project. So in response to these kind of concerns, they sought to kind of tamp down the expectation. They sought to kind of brush it, brush it away. And then over the course of research, what was also fascinating is when I was going to oil and gas industry conferences, thinking about people like Kate, who I'd reported on and whose lives I had, been led into and learned about. And then I was also hearing things like, for instance, if you want to talk about even within industry, like the health effects for people within industry are bad. People who work on oil rigs suffer incredible mental health problems, as well as people who work on oil processing facilities around the country. The incidence of cancer are incredibly high amongst oil industry workers. So I mean, even on the industry's own terms, even in the area that it controls, there are major health risks beyond the systemic kind of, but beyond those connected to those systemic risks that we're talking about. And I think it's really important, and I think it's actually really interesting and important that work with organizations like DEA are putting this information into that context, because again, it makes it personal. It makes people aware that this thing that's happening out there, so abstract, is close to home, is something that affects me here and now.
Yeah, I guess that's really the thing, isn't it? There's lots of people around the country who are personally experiencing the effects of climate change, be it inhaling smoke as our eastern seaboard goes up in smoke, or the terrible floods, heat waves. So Darren, just back on your point about the sort of the economics and how you and your organisation envisage the collapse of the fossil fuel industry just by virtue of the fact that they're running out of investors, and your point that things, renewable energy systems keep coming on board, and there's more and more storage. How do we quicken it? I mean, we've got a fossil fuels industry that is fighting tooth and nail to delay, regardless of the ethics of it, as Kate pointed out. And we know from all of the science that delay is our enemy. So, how do we quicken the pace of the transition away, given that we've got all of these fabulous new systems coming on board? It just doesn't seem, when you're watching the media, it doesn't seem like it's happening quick enough. It doesn't seem like there's enough kind of progress, really.
I don't mean to oversimplify the problem in my analysis, because this is actually a very complex kind of beast. But I think from my perspective, markets react extremely quickly to substantive price issues. And I'll give you an example. In Queensland at the moment, most of my work centres around stewardship and materials recovery. So I focus a lot on the recycling and decommissioning of solar modules. In Queensland, 1.2 million solar modules are taken off roofs every year. They have an average age of 8 years, so they're very young, right? So solar modules will last 30 years. So most of these modules, 800,000 of them, are collected and shipped offshore essentially into Africa and sold into emergent markets. So that's a $50 million market each year. That market evaporated in 2 weeks. And that evaporated in 2 weeks. It hasn't completely evaporated, but it's mostly gone because of the decrease in the costs of modules out of China. It happened that fast. And so it's big price signals like that. Once the economics hits a certain zone, and nobody ever knows what that zone is, but it hits a certain zone, and then suddenly markets just collapse and change. And it's my expectation that that's sort of what's going to happen to the fossil fuel industry. It'll happen very quickly. And even in EVs, we look at EVs, the new EVs coming out of China, their price points are aggressively low, and the quality of the products is fantastic. So that it does happen very quickly. Having said that, what I'm talking about is a lot to do with consumer markets. When we talk about grid scale, it's slightly different. There's a lot of delays in grid scale, and for a couple of reasons. Principally, you used the word before, Steph, delays, and there's been so many issues with planning approval delays for large-scale solar, including currently the Biodiversity Environment Protection Act from the federal government. And a lot of those delays are caused through nefarious people, parties, organisations putting pressure on the government. That's my view. And so, yeah, there are delays. So we do need to make it very clear to our representatives that, we want proper planning so that we can get the large-scale grid-scale solar in place as fast as we can. So it is still an issue, yeah.
But how does the fossil fuel industry in all of their guises get such access to the Prime Minister? and other ministers. I mean, how do they manage to continue to do it if the writing's on the wall? That's my first question. And the second question is, you referred to the EPBC Act and that it's delaying renewable energy projects. So to my reckoning, then, that means that the EPBC Act is failing on many fronts, because if you read the last State of the Environment report, this country is an absolute disgrace with protecting its environment. So that's probably a discussion for another day. But, you know, I mean, I just, there's a sort of a mismatch between, I guess, you know, it's not the first time I've heard these arguments about the economics is going to kill fossil fuels before anything else. I'm not sure I quite buy it. I actually think the fossil fuels industry, if they're able to remain in the room, which they currently clearly can, if we look at what's been going on with this government and previous governments, you're never going to get the kind of change that is required, because those vested interests still carry a lot of sway, and the economics doesn't actually seem to matter. Can you?
Yeah, so
do you have any views on that?
I do. So I can't really talk to how they get access to political people in power. I mean, because I don't know that. What I can say is that this is very complicated and has lots of different segments to the market. So I think with regard to economics, I do see that this is a stepwise change that's happening at the moment that we haven't seen yet. And there are lots of examples of markets where this kind of thing has happened in the past. So yeah, I can see why you feel in some ways anxious about it. I do too. And I've never been a tech-based hopium character, because I've always got question marks about, you know, based on that saying that I started off with, it always takes longer than you think and happens sooner than you expect. And that's the insight in that statement. It has to do with all of a sudden there are these stepwise changes and markets change. Yeah. So my comment on the Biodiversity and Environment Protection Act is that we are hoping to see some clarity in planning rules, so that it makes it easier for large-scale solar to stand up, but at the same time ensures the protection of the environment and our important biodiversity. So part of my remit is about biodiversity. I'm very interested in the fact that large-scale solar can act as a vector for improving biodiversity, just as it can act as a vector for improving yields, produce yields on farms. These two things are not widely known, but there's a lot of research available which talks to that. And I think in regional communities, not all regional communities, but in some, they see the benefits of hosting large-scale solar because of those benefits. But again, there are actors in the marketplace which are sort of working against that.
So if I can just jump in for a second as well about the question about political influence and access and all these sorts of complicated, thorny questions. And I appreciate that as a real curveball to throw your way, Darren. So when you look at the way this works, I mean, people's mind immediately goes to things like donations, and donations themselves don't necessarily buy you access, right? They usually just send as a signal to which political operatives can say, hey, listen to me, I've got things to talk about. But part of the book, or part of the project, was looking at that question of, right, well, how do we end up here? How do we end up with governments listening to companies and their industry associations above the average person, and putting that public interest second, essentially, behind business interest? And there are a number of ways to look at this. You can look at it sociologically, you can look at it politically, you can look at it economically, you can look at it ethically, but one of the core concepts to understand is this idea of state capture, this idea of business interests being able to use their industry associations to shape the policy, which is that kind of if you think about government like a laptop, policy is kind of like the programming of that laptop. And so the goal is to either, shape the way that policy is made, shape the way procedures are made, or move into significant points within that system and control the outcome. And when you look at Australia, that's kind of what's happened at this point. And people do things for different reasons. Some, it's political in the sense that Labor just doesn't want the Greens and wants to, and is afraid it might not get elected. Politicians feel like the public needs to authorize them to do a certain action. And if they don't feel like they will have that authorization, they won't do it because they're afraid of you losing the next election. Sometimes it's as much as going to the right party. Sometimes, in some cases, for instance, I have documents. I'm working on a new story now where William Walkley, the guy who founded the Australian oil industry, who founded the Australian Media Awards, was personal friends with a lot of finance journalists in the middle 50s and encouraged them to buy shares in Ampol directly, right? Because that would give them a personal financial interest in the stake of his company. Things have changed since then, but that was one of his strategies to boost profile. So you can see how that starts to change. But then you move away from those kind of that influence, those kind of hard tactics that lead to that influence. And you look at more broadly, there's been a real concerted effort by these industry associations, particularly who act for companies so that the individual companies aren't seen to act, to shape the way we think about these issues, to shape the framing, to shape, to control what options, what outcomes we think are possible from at any given moment. And you see this to the extent of these companies and the industry associations had programs to get into schools to try and spread the idea that gas is good in schools. You can find there's a photo that I have of Tony Abbott reading the Big Book of Oil and Gas and looking very confused at the launch in Canberra. You can they did this explicitly as part of their public relations campaign. You can find them trying to get into universities for very similar reasons. You can find them moving into the art space, into sport, into every aspect of life because of that social capital it gives them in the individual communities in which they operate and with their political representatives. So there are a number of tactics that have been played for a long time, and they all go towards ensuring the longevity of this industry. And when we talk about this, the name of the game from the beginning, and I think Darren's quite right, the economics is fundamentally against oil. Solar is cheaper than ever. It's white-anting their business case. China is pumping these things out at the rate of like some spectacular rate a day. But fundamentally the game has, and I know this because I found in writing documents from a briefing that one of these oil industry association people shared with their membership, which was ahead of Kyoto. The name of the game was to draw out the clock as long as possible, to take as much time as possible, to allow them to run their inefficient oil refineries, coal mines, processing plants, all that capital stock, to run that into the ground. That's been the game, and that's been the game for the last 20 years. And they're succeeding because of that element because they're able to generate a certain sense of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that is where the political contest has been for the last 20 years. That's why we're in this mess, essentially.
I really like that of the fossil fuels industry have basically designed the software that is on the computer of, government or the nation. Having spent many years working in the public service and also as an ecologist, I can totally see that rings absolutely true to me.
And you don't even need to do all of it, just specific parts of it, I think, is the key thing as well.
Yeah, specific parts of it. You just limit people's view. Okay, great. Well, I think we've got some fantastic ideas that have come out. Are there any final thoughts from any of the panelists regarding sort of particular messages that you want to portray about your perspectives here before we move on to questions? I'll start with you. Sorry, I'll start with you, Kate.
I'll be 60 seconds.
That's fine. Go for it.
Fundamentally, we've got a situation of state capture, where we've got fossil fuel industry basically being able to have a lot of political influence, both major parties accepting donations from them, and set it up over many decades. We've also got a fossil fuel industry that is so embroiled into our life that we have many members of the media that continue to allow it to continue, if that makes sense. We have good media people as well. I just want to acknowledge that. But we have, some bad players in the media. And so what that stuff means is about, you know, what is possible, this idea of what is possible in our world, and we have to shift it. We have to kind of shift that narrative and say, no, what is possible is to get us off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And so, you know, the time when we have our most power as a populace is when there's an election. And so I think the fundamental thing that, you know, I would say to everybody is, you know, when you're standing in that ballot box, vote for the person that'll do the best thing by your climate and put that first, because that's the most important thing. And my second last little message is, you know, when we get back to ethics, if we just change everything we said, you know, about what they do, and let's, you know, replace the word fossil fuels with the word asbestos, or replace it with the word tobacco, and then you start to go, actually, they are just conning us. It's a completely unethical game. And we should be angry. We should think about what this means for ourselves and for all the people that come after us, and fight for our future. So that's where we're at.
Thanks, Kate. Darren, any messages?
Yes, Kate, I agree with you. The vote's really important. I think that the vote at the ballot box is important, but your vote as part of a member of a political party is equally important, whatever party you choose to join. I think we have a very a wealthy society, and as a result, we don't spend enough time thinking about our political process. And I think people should become more involved in their political parties of their choice, and hold their local members or hold their local delegate to account by being involved in the actual process itself. So I think your vote within the process is important. And any of you who've been involved in some of these political parties, some of the meetings that they have are, you know, real echo chambers. So they end up not being connected to communities, and certainly not connected to facts. So I think the more you can get involved politically, the better, whatever colour party that you choose to get involved in. I think it's really important.
That's so true. So I spent nearly 20 years in and out of the federal public service. And when I started, we actually did a lot of public consultation. By the time I left and transferred into medicine, you would never, ever be going out to actually consult the public. So it was all vested interests who had voices to ministers. And I think that's been the biggest change, or was one of the biggest changes that I saw in my time in the public service. Mm-hmm. Royce, did you have any parting points?
Yes. I can't say how to fix it because I'm not a legislator. I'm not a politician. I'm just a reporter. I go out and I speak to people who know more things than I do and who are smarter than I am, and I come back and tell everyone what they said. What I can say is that I get asked the question, are you depressed after writing this book? And my response is always, well, we can't afford despair. But second of all, I have found in my capacity as a reporter, I have been covering fossil fuel divestment campaigns. I have been covering people in their like as small as their local knitters club. You know, there was one mother who scratched out the Woodside logo on her like kids' clothing, which became a big kind of moment of contention within that particular club, and forced that organization to kind of reckon with the fact they were taking fossil fuel money. I've spoken with activists who have been arrested. I've spoken with oil industry people who are no longer oil industry people and who now are trying to talk about, you know, solutions in the same way Darren is. You know, I'm aware of people in churches who are putting pressure on the institutions that they are engaged with every day, people in their schools, in their universities. I think that there is a lot more going on than people realize. I think that the sum total of that pressure is beginning to change the frame of the discussion, as Kate was suggesting. Back to this idea of, you know, like it's creating the conditions in which something different becomes possible. And I think that it's very easy to, I saw someone, for instance, in the comments saying we've been having this conversation for the last 20 years. Oh, is it, you know, what's new about it? Well, well, I would say that it seems to be having an effect. You know, we're at a point where, you know, where we're looking at for the first time the end of coal oil demand. We're looking at kind of the phase out of coal, and, you know, potentially even the undermining of the case for gas, despite efforts to promote nuclear or to do whatever else, you know, whatever other kind of idea is going. That's happening. That's tangible. But that change historically speaking, doesn't happen fast. It isn't obvious. It feels tiresome. It feels boring. It's laborious. But when it finally happens, when that breakthrough moment comes, as Darren suggested, everything is different. And I think that's a thing to hang on to and to understand that is happening now. It's just that whatever sphere you're in, you may not necessarily have that bird's eye view of the landscape.